Thank you for that insightful discussion on how the United States can leverage our carbon advantage through smart domestic trade policy. As we strive to reduce emissions here at home, we should be proud of the progress we've made and strive to continue strengthening our global energy leadership. I'm Sean Ethelter, Vice President of Government Relations at Crest Forum. National Clean Energy Week is a celebration of bipartisan collaboration and clean energy leadership. We are proud to feature remarks from a number of congressional speakers from both sides of the aisle. It's my pleasure to introduce the next group of members of Congress to speak about their clean energy priorities.
Hey there, everybody. Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. I obviously want to thank you guys for the incredible, responsible work you do. We know that we have our work cut out. Of course, we want to be good stewards of the environment. I think we're all called to do that. We need to make sure we do that in a responsible way. And we got the federal government standing in the way of making that happen. But the good news is I think there is some bipartisan momentum making progress, particularly related to siting. And you all are experts, and you realize that we're going to need to streamline the siting process if we're going to really unlock America's clean energy future in a lot of different ways. Certainly from a high voltage transmission line perspective, that's really important. We also need to make sure that we're doing a better job of mining some of these critical minerals. We have made it almost impossible to site a new mine of almost any kind in this country. And that means that we are increasingly reliant on China for some of these critical minerals. And again, you all are more experts than I am, so you realize that the rare earth minerals aren't actually rare at all. They're located just about everywhere, but in low concentrations. And so we can have mining operations in America that find those minerals so that we can have battery solutions here in this country, so that we're not more reliant on China in the future than we have been on the Middle East in the past. So we've got our work cut out for us. I do know this is an area where the White House and Speaker McCarthy agree that we do need to make it easier to develop big projects in this country. If we fail to do that, we will not be in charge of the global future of clean energy. We are going to be, we will continue to be reliant on others who maybe their values aren't quite the same as ours. So you will find me a reliable ally in those areas. I have been going back all the way to 15 years ago when I was a state energy regulator, and I understood the need to have a long-term plan for transmission lines so that we can get the places that are best positioned to generate that renewable energy to the markets where there is the greatest demand for it. This stuff requires some planning. It requires working together. I know you guys have been on the forefront of that for a long time, and I'm happy to be a part of the team as well. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Congressman Randy Feenstra. Homegrown American energy is vital to our economic prosperity and national security. That's why Congress must support policies that incentivize domestic energy production and restore our energy independence. Representing the top ethanol and biodiesel producing district in the country, I'm especially passionate about expanding biofuel production to achieve energy security. These homegrown fuels support our farmers, lower gas prices for our families, and end our reliance on foreign countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela for our energy needs. I also support traditional energy like oil and natural gas and renewable sources like wind and solar. Together, I am confident that we can make life more affordable for our families through common sense energy policy.
Policymakers face no shortage of questions and trade-offs as they design solutions to reduce global emissions. At what pace and scale will the U.S. need to deploy clean energy technologies to achieve global net zero goals? How will this energy transition impact energy security and the U.S.'s position today as a major energy exporter? What are the sources of uncertainty that policymakers and industry should pay attention to in the coming years? I'm Chrissy Harbin, Vice President of External Affairs at Crest Forum. It's my pleasure to introduce David Palola with Breakthrough Energy, who will explore these questions through a synthesis of new energy systems modeling results from evolved energy research. David, over to you.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this discussion on modeling pathways to net zero, case study on energy security as the U.S. decarbonizes. I'm David Palola, Manager of Research and Analysis on the U.S. Policy and Advocacy team at Breakthrough Energy. I'm happy that we've brought together a great panel for the discussion. So in this session, we will explore long-term future pathways for U.S. fuel production and exports with the goal of understanding the energy security implications of domestic and global decarbonization policy. The energy crisis precipitated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine underscores the need to advance energy policy that simultaneously addresses energy security and decarbonization imperatives. This dual need raises many critical policy questions, some of which we'll discuss today. Two of our panelists join us from Evolved Energy Research, which has been a key source of modeling and analysis for policymakers, both on technical pathways the U.S. can take to get to net zero, as well as the impact of specific energy policy proposals in recent years. Over the last couple of years, Breakthrough Energy has been supporting an annual modeling study by Evolved called the Annual Decarbonization Perspective, or ADP. The ADP examines a variety of net zero scenarios for the U.S., accounting for numerous sources of societal, economic, and technological uncertainties. We see this work as crucial in illuminating the trade-offs inherent to different decarbonization strategies and helping guide policy and investments that are diversified and robust to uncertainty. So this year, we wanted Evolved to integrate the lens of energy security into their modeling, and we're eager to have them share some of their results with you all. We'll start first with a brief overview of this year's modeling, then dive into the results of Evolved's energy security and exports analysis, and finally wrap up with a Q&A discussion. Joining me today, I have Ryan Jones, co-founder of Evolved Energy Research and lead modeler on many of the best-known national decarbonization studies, including the Net Zero America study with Princeton University. Jim Williams, professor in energy systems management at the University of San Francisco and senior fellow at Evolved Energy Research, and Carl Hausker, senior fellow in the climate program at World Resources Institute, a former vice president at ICF International, also formerly deputy assistant administrator in EPA's policy office, and was also the chief economist of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. With that, I will pass it to Ryan and Jim to start with the overview of their recent modeling work.
Great. Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to kick things off by talking a bit about the domestic pathways to decarbonization. And that's really going to serve as the backdrop for the further remarks that Jim is going to make on energy exports. So the goal of the ADP has been numerous, but we are trying to produce a set of pathways and data sets with sufficient granularity to allow actionable emissions reduction plans across the U.S. Our 2023 report and data sets are scheduled to be released in early October. One thing to note is that the ADP is both policy and technology agnostic, which I think is a very important foundation for the analysis. We're exploring a number of different scenarios that chart very different courses for U.S. energy system transition. These span the gamut from everything from 100% renewable primary energy scenario to a scenario that does not build renewables any faster than we are today. We're not going to have time to get into all those details, but I'm actually going to focus on the next slide here on the central scenario, which is kind of the lowest cost, all technology option pathway for reaching net zero, and just give a brief outline of kind of that transition pathway before turning it over to Jim. So next slide, Jim. Okay, so these are Sankey diagrams that track the flow of energy through the economy. They start with primary energy on the left and go to final energy on the right. We have the 2021 energy system, or our energy system of today, there on the left, and then our 2050 central scenario on the right. So a few, kind of obvious differences here in this energy transition to point out. The first is the energy system today is dominated by gas production, oil production in the U.S., oil imports, and coal also going to electricity. In the 2050 scenario, the fossil fuel contributions in primary energy go down, renewables expand, and then one kind of node further, you can see the role of electricity has expanded significantly in a decarbonized energy system. So kind of among the strategies here, we have decarbonizing electricity, fuel switching to electric sources for that clean energy, and then other strategies that are not directly shown here, such as carbon capture and management. So much of that gas production that you see in the 2050 central scenario there on the right, which is going to thermal power plants, have carbon capture and is kind of a key part of the strategy for reaching net zero in this case. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to kind of take us away in talking about the energy import and export piece of these Sankey diagrams.
Thank you, Ryan. Historically, energy transitions have been connected to changes in geopolitics and national security. In our work, we're looking at decarbonization through the lens of several different indicators of energy security, including energy supply diversity, electricity system reliability, strategic material supply chains, industrial competitiveness, military mission readiness, and today's topic, global energy markets. I'll start with our two main take-home messages. First, domestic decarbonization and domestic fossil fuel extraction and exports are not necessarily at odds in the medium term. Reductions in domestic fossil fuel consumption driven by electrification can actually improve the U.S. geopolitical position by increasing the amount available for export, while at the same time limiting the U.S. economy's exposure to oil price shocks. Second, in the long term, the volumes and composition of global energy trade will definitely change in a decarbonizing world. But the U.S. is on a very competitive footing in emerging carbon neutral fuel markets. And it is in our best interest to prepare for this outcome by encouraging their development domestically and abroad. The U.S. energy security situation has changed dramatically since imports peaked in 2007. Shale technology plus policies such as efficiency standards have combined to increase domestic production while keeping consumption flat, with the result that the U.S. became a net exporter of natural gas in 2017 and of petroleum in 2020. The blue circle shows when total energy exports began to exceed total energy imports in 2019. Further, the composition of oil imports has changed a lot, with more than 60% of U.S. imports now coming from Canada and Mexico versus only about 10% from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. is still connected to a global oil market and thus to the ups and downs of oil prices, but from an energy security standpoint, it's in its strongest position in decades. So, how might this situation change in the future in a decarbonizing world? This figure from the International Energy Agency describes three futures for global oil demand. The blue line is a scenario based on existing policies. The yellow line is one based on announced policy goals. And the green line is a global net zero scenario. The ranges, as you can see, are very large by 2050, from volumes of 100 million barrels per day down to 25 million barrels per day, with corresponding oil prices from over $90 per barrel to less than $30 a barrel in the net zero case. The Department of Energy's annual energy outlook for the U.S. reflects this uncertainty. with 2050 exports that range from nearly zero in the low oil price case to nearly 10 million barrels per day of net exports in the high oil price case. In a decarbonized world, there are three sources of fuels and feedstocks for applications that cannot be electrified. Fuels derived from electricity, including hydrogen and ammonia, and hydrocarbon fuels that are synthesized using hydrogen and a carbon source. Fuels derived from biomass, fuels derived from petroleum and or natural gas using carbon capture, either in fuel production or offsetting of emissions. In the three IEA global scenarios just mentioned, the red lines are fossil energy and the green lines are non-fossil energy, and the range of possible outcomes shown is obviously very large. Accordingly, we have created scenarios for the United States that all reach net zero domestically, but cover a wide range of possible global market contexts for exports. The export scenarios differ along two dimensions, volume and carbon intensity. So you can have four combinations with high or low export volume and high or low carbon intensity of exports. All but the upper right scenario that has both high volume and high carbon intensity are compatible with reaching net zero globally. This shows the export mix for each of those cases. In the carbon neutral export cases, the remaining fossil exports are offset by carbon capture within the US. Among non-fossil fuel sources, biofuels are the lowest cost fuel source initially and dominate in the low volume case. That's the bottom left. But with increasing volume, ammonia, partly driven by 45B tax credits, and e-fuels, driven by falling renewable generation costs, become more competitive. The US ultimately has a larger potential to make e-fuels than biofuels, since renewables are less land constrained than biofuels. But all of these decarbonized fuels have supply curves such that their relative cost differs by location in the country and by different export scenarios. So we expect to see a mixed fuel blend, whatever that the particulars happen to be, rather than a single winner. These show the bookend cases for domestic oil and gas production. For oil, the figures on the left highlight a strategic decision the US faces, whether and how to prioritize domestic production over imports in a declining global oil market. The orange line shows the trajectory of US domestic oil production in a net zero pathway if imports are maintained. The blue line shows what domestic production could be if the US phased out imports of foreign crude and used only domestic crude. In the low volume carbon neutral world on the bottom left, this would extend current levels of US domestic production until about 2035. In the high volume, high carbon traded international market, this would add at least another 10 years. For natural gas on the right, in the short to medium term, there's an uptick in gas production due to coal to gas switching in power and LNG exports. And in the longer term, while declining, gas production remains higher relative to oil, in part due to domestic use of natural gas with carbon capture and storage and power generation, and to natural gas use in producing blue hydrogen. The economist Stephen Koppitz argued that many US recessions were triggered by oil price shocks, and he identified three conditions that applied to each: a rapid rate of oil price increase, a rapid decline in demand in response to that price increase, and then the condition that makes these hiccups strongly affect the economy, namely that crude oil expenditures constitute a significant share of GDP, for which he identified 4% of GDP as the threshold. So in this figure, the black line shows US oil consumption over the century from 1950 to 2050 using historical data through last year and model data for a net zero scenario going forward. On the x-axis in red, we see historical and forecast US GDP over the same period, and then some of the recession-causing price shocks are also identified in red. The point is that if the US follows a net zero pathway, domestic oil consumption expenditures would fall below a 1% share of GDP by about 2035, bringing it back to where it was before 1970. Obviously, by insulating the macroeconomy from the impacts of oil price shocks, decarbonization provides a huge national security benefit for the United States. Going forward, the US has the resources to be competitive in all forms of primary energy. Excellent wind and solar resources, excellent biomass resources, and excellent carbon storage potential to use in tandem with the remaining use of fossil fuels. This strong resource base results in expected production costs for US fuels, both fossil and decarbonized, that will be competitive in global markets across a wide range of scenarios. It is generally accepted the US will continue to be the lowest cost natural gas producer. In an increasingly depressed oil market, the US would expect to lose market share to lower cost producers, but even there, the gap could be narrowed by international carbon regulations since the US is a cleaner oil producer than other countries. In terms of decarbonized liquid and gas fuels, our modeling indicates that US production costs would be lower than forecast cost for the same fuels produced elsewhere. Analysts outside the US agree with this assessment, as seen in this European Commission study, which forecasts the US as being the lowest cost producer of e-fuels. However, it's worth noting that the US isn't expected to have as large a cost advantage over potential competitors as it does in the case of natural gas. The bright side is that the ability of most countries to make more of their own fuels makes it hard for any OPEC-like entity to corner global energy markets. The downside of that for would-be exporters is a lower overall volume of fuels traded internationally. But this is partly compensated on the revenue side by much higher prices per BTU for the fuels that are traded. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ryan and Jim. I know that was a whirlwind through a lot of work that you all put into this. So we see a lot of modeling on how the US decarbonizes in a vacuum. I think it's really fascinating now to have more work looking at how the US decarbonization progress interacts with global energy market trends, especially as the demand for hydrocarbon fuels globally is larger and longer lasting than it will likely be domestically. So to open the Q&A, I want to start with you, Carl, as you have deep experience in how modeling is used to guide policymakers in industry. And so my question to start off the Q&A is, how would you describe the role of scenario modeling like this in policymaking? And what do you take away from this work around how we manage the energy transition in a way that both achieves climate goals and addresses other critical priorities such as global energy security?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, David. Good to be here. I first want to commend EER for looking at doing modeling with multiple scenarios, including edge cases where they deliberately sort of make some extreme assumptions to see what would the world look like if something happened. What would the world look like if we did not get more political support for expansion of nuclear power? What would the world look like if we did not expand the transmission system and multiply solar and wind by huge amounts. It's very important to use modeling to guide us and create options, and not use modeling to say, aha, this is the one path that we should follow. And I would urge viewers to distrust modeling that just puts a single scenario out there. So what we see in the EER modeling is the four cases that Jim and Ryan described, three of which let us achieve our climate goals and still keep the U.S. in a very positive position as an energy exporter. The one case, the upper right, high imports and high carbon intensity, we won't make it. So this is generally good news for the United States because we have incredible technological innovation that has occurred over the last 20 years, both in the production of fossil fuels and in bringing down the cost of solar and wind. So we will be well positioned regardless of how fast the rest of the world decarbonizes.
Great, thank you, Carl. So Ryan, next question I have is for you. So some have opposed legislation that would make siting renewable energy and transmission easier because they fear it would also make it easier to site new fossil fuel infrastructure. And IEA just came out with a new net zero roadmap today. They noted that if we assume the world is on a net zero trajectory, we don't need new conventional long lead time oil and gas projects post 2023. But they also argue that investments to reduce oil and gas demand should occur in advance of reductions to supply investment in order to avoid price shocks and ensure an orderly transition. So I want to get your view on how policymakers should be thinking about these concerns around siting and permitting of energy infrastructure in the U.S.
Thanks, David. Yeah, while it's true that virtually all scenarios that reach net zero see some oil and gas extraction declines in the long term, our view is that really needs to start on the demand side. So it's nice to be able to imagine that by blocking supplies of new oil and gas extraction, that the kind of project of domestic decarbonization can be advanced. But very likely what's going to happen in those scenarios is we are trading oil and gas extraction in the U.S. for greater imports. So our view is that while it's kind of unlikely that easier domestic oil and gas extraction will meaningfully slow decarbonization, it is certainly true that making renewables easier to site, wind and solar, which we know we need to build at roughly 3 times the rate we are today. If we make those projects easier, that is going to do quite a bit for kind of the achievement of the pathways that we laid out here in the ADP.
Great, yeah, thank you for that perspective. I think the tension between the supply side and demand side actions is pretty complicated, and it's helpful to dig a little bit deeper into it. So Jim, your modeling showed how electrification and reducing domestic oil consumption can provide energy security benefits by helping to insulate our economy from oil price shocks. We're also seeing empirically, so not just in the modeling, but actually looking at the data, that the cost of geopolitically driven oil price shocks can be massive. So some recent research from Brown University and MIT estimated that Europe spent as much as $1 trillion in increased fossil fuel costs in the year following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Are there any other significant energy security implications of the transition, either on the opportunity side or the risk side, that policymakers should be paying attention to?
Yeah, thank you, David. Great question. There are many ways that decarbonization can improve our national security by increasing our basically independence from international supplies, but there are also some potential vulnerabilities. And these can be addressed, but it is why evaluating and comparing the energy security implications of different pathways that reach net zero, but do it in different ways is very important. So just to give a couple of quick examples, in a net zero economy, a much greater share of end use energy will be delivered as electricity, as Ryan said, potentially resulting in greater impacts when electricity supplies are disrupted. And in our modeling, we find that hybridization, fuel diversity, and redundancy can help alleviate these problems. For another example, already alluded to, strategic minerals such as lithium, copper, rare earths can potentially become objects of geopolitical competition. Pathways that rely somewhat less on them on the demand side can clearly have some advantages. And on the supply side, both exploration and here the recent discovery of the lithium volcano in Nevada comes to mind. But exploration and the building of domestic industries for extracting and processing these materials will not only provide U.S. jobs, but also help ensure U.S. energy security going forward.
Great. Thank you, Jim. So obviously a lot of opportunity, but also many things to be still paying attention to. Carl, I want to come back to you and get your perspective on kind of this supply side and demand side tension. So, whether we're on a global net zero pathway or not, domestic demand for hydrocarbon fuels is likely to decline faster than global demand. And Evolve's modeling showed how the U.S. could be really well positioned to supply low or carbon neutral fuels to global markets to meet that demand. So what steps do you think policymakers can take to help promote low carbon fuels or to accelerate decarbonization abroad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's first be absolutely clear that we need to get to net zero by mid-century. We are seeing the incredible impacts of climate change, particularly this year. So we want very much to get on that 1.5 degree pathway, and what EER has mapped out several different ways to do it. We don't want to simply export more oil and gas if other countries are not moving forward. What we want to do is promote the use of hydrogen and ammonia and low carbon or zero carbon biofuels. And there's a number of ways we can do that through border tax adjustments, through technological innovation that we can share with other countries, and of course through the mechanisms of the UNFCCC. So, the good news is that we're incredibly smart, we're incredibly innovative, and if there's oil and gas demand still out there to meet, we're going to be pretty good at it. But let's not take our eye off the ball that we have already entered a period of very dangerous climate change, and we need to help move the entire globe toward low or zero carbon fuels and zero carbon electricity.
Thanks, Carl. So I guess in the last minute here, I see a question from the audience. I want to get your thoughts, Ryan and Jim, on what the net zero transition will mean for U.S. Energy prices in the medium term. So real quick perspective on that.
It likely means some declining volumes, David, which also means lower fossil fuel prices. At the same time, we are making kind of more capital intensive investments in new forms of energy. Most of our work has shown that when that is managed correctly, the net cost of this energy system transition, even though the flows of capital and where that goes in the economy can change significantly, the net cost is really not a barrier at this point, given a lot of the technological progress we've seen over the last decade or two. So that's kind of a bit of good news there. on the cost side.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all of our panelists and the audience for attending this session. I think we're at time here.
Mm-hmm.